to have you here, Bruce. I mean, I know, I don't know if I mentioned, I did not mention this in the intro, but I've known Bruce for, I'm not even going to say how many years, because then it's going to date us back a while. But I met Bruce at USA Today when I was working at Gannett and USA Weekend and USA Today. And at the time, Bruce was the research librarian there, and you'll tell us more about that. And I remember going into the USA Today library, and Bruce was just like, he was like the knowledge bank for the whole place, right? So anything you wanted to know, you would go see Bruce. And obviously I was doing leadership development at the time, and I would come in and ask for things around leadership, even though I wasn't a reporter, I was in the functions. And he was just so helpful. And then we started talking about leadership, and I just thought he was just the most amazing person. So I've been so excited to see his career and how he's really, and I've already given you the intro about him, but I'm going to let him talk about that. But I just wanted to let you know how he's one of the people that I really, really admire and I really respect as a person. So Bruce, I'm so honored to have you here today. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm really excited about our conversation today.
Yeah. So I wanted to start out. Okay. Whenever I do this podcast, I talk to people who are accomplished like yourself. And you know, whether it's a top level executive, it's a thought leader, it's somebody who's done research, written books, all we see are the accomplishments, right? We see this list of things they've done, and it seems as if it's just so seamless and all of that. And so what I want to ask you is, tell us a little bit about Bruce. Tell us a little bit about you and a little bit about the journey that you were on that led you to where you are today, because we all have a journey that isn't as perfect as the accolades that are on our resume or on our bio.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thanks for the question, because it really has been a journey. And I very often look back on it. I tend to be an introspective person and kind of try to fit in the past with the future and see, what's the kind of continuum. And for me, and I loved what you said about our days at USA Today, because it really was a formative period for me and really represented, and I hope that some people can resonate with this, because in terms of whether you would call it, late bloomer or, although now when I look back at that term, we're only talking about Ben being in my kind of like mid-30s. But the fact of the matter is that before that time at USA Today, I wouldn't say I was really directionless, but I would say because I loved music, and I still do, rock music in particular, and that's what I was working around. And I had a lot of writing experience, which I loved, writing about rock music. And I was on, I don't know if you call it the fringes of the music business, but somewhere else. But I really realized that it wasn't shaping up to be a real career, and a career that I could feel really good about. So for a variety of reasons, I went to get a master's in library and information science from Catholic University here in Washington, D.C. And I did that really I was at that point not a particularly big library user. I really didn't know that much about libraries, but I learned really quickly.
Okay, so wait, so I have to pause there, right? So why library? If you weren't a big library user, there had to be like a reason.
Yeah, well, a friend of mine felt that, who was a librarian, felt that my mind worked, even though I didn't realize it, my mind worked in that way of what a librarian would do. And I did it, I had a lot of interests, not just music, but really a lot of other interests. And that I could that would be one way, if I became a librarian, that I could focus those interests and maybe go into one. There is the specialty of music librarianship, which I thought about for a while, but I decided it was not for me. And USA Today happened to be really the perfect thing. I was so, and one reason why I say that is because I was interested in so many things. Becoming a reference librarian at USA Today because of the 5 sections of the paper, plus the corporate side where I work with you, because we did both those things in the library, I was able to use all those things. I'm a sports fan, so I
Oh,
got to look up
yeah.
things about sports that, and another thing I think that's important about that, besides, with folks like you that I got to interact with, I just met so many cool people, other cool people they were on the business side, they were reporters, they were editors, they were whoever, and some of whom, that I still stay in touch with to this day. So it was really sort of this perfect thing. In 1986, I had while a student at Catholic, I had a library management class, and the textbook was an 839-page book. Now it was a summer course. We didn't have to read the entire thing, but it was a classic Peter Drucker book called Management, Tasks, Responsibilities, and Practices. It came out in 1974, I believe. So it was not all that old at that point. And I had heard about Drucker, but I hadn't really read him at all before that. And this book spoke to me on a very deep and profound level. And it sparked my interest certainly in him, but also in management, leadership, topics like that. And then Drucker became a real specialty for me. So years later, when I was able to start writing for the paper while still being a reference librarian, research librarian, anytime there was a book by or about Drucker, I wrote about it. I interviewed people who wrote books about him. I was able to interview Peter himself, although at the beginning it was just virtual interviews. And then the gods sort of came together, as has been the case for me my career ever since I started at USA Today, which was really only the year after I graduated. So it was 1987. And so what happened was he was a Drucker who really did have quite a following in the library world for a number of reasons. Drucker was the keynote, or one of the keynote speakers. The other one was Doris Kearns Goodwin, fantastic leadership writer. So it was like Peter on Monday morning and Doris Kearns Goodwin on Tuesday morning. And anyway, he was the keynote speaker for the library conference that I would have been going to anyway. It's called the Special Libraries Association conference. And so I say the gods came together because I was going to this thing anyway. But I asked my editor in the money section, Michael Clements, I said, I'm sure I can get an in-person interview with Peter. Would you be able to, could we turn this into a feature story, not just a book review?
Right.
And he said, one of the things he said was, well, this is when the corporate scandals were really going on. He said, well, if you can get him talking about the corporate scandals, let's see what happens. So God bless him.
You needed a twist on it, right? You needed some sort of a a hook.
Yeah, exactly right. It couldn't just be, well, here's an interview with Peter Drucker.
It had to be newsworthy in the main section.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And here's he's speaking at a library conference. Like, for most people, they're not going to care about that. The other thing that came up where the gods smiled upon me, because yes, Peter did talk about these things, where in terms of another kind of hook that happened in that summer of 2002, was that he was going to be given awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is the highest civilian honor in the country. So what happened was I interviewed him for 4 hours the night before his keynote. We were staying at the same hotel, the Westin Bonaventure in Los Angeles. And so we started the interview in his hotel room, and then we went to a Japanese restaurant, which had a lot of significance because of his work in Japan. So we finished the interview at the Japanese restaurant. And one thing he said to me, he said, well, you live in Washington, right? And I said, yeah. He said, well, I'm coming there in a month, but I'm sworn to secrecy. Why? I'm going, wow, like, what's going on here? And we still didn't know, but a little bit later on, it was announced that he was doing this. So we were able to put this into the article. So a lot of really just amazing things came together. And because that went so well, I felt the story came out really well. And my interplay with him, first time in person, 4 hours, went really well. That emboldened me to say, I want to write a book about Drucker and the individual. And I really started on it not too long later. After that, I went out to California and did some research. I went out again a few months later when I was able to interview him in person. And really all these things just started falling together. However, the book didn't come out to about 6 or 7 years after that. So I had to have a lot of persistence about this. And unfortunately, Peter had passed away in the interim. So he never got to see, he didn't even know I had a book contract, you know,
Wow.
but he was a really good sport about, you know, sitting for interviews. And I felt the book came out really well. But again, it didn't come out till 2009. So
What a story. I mean, when you think about that, Bruce, and the way you describe that, it's almost, again, maybe this is on my mind because I just talked to somebody about synchronicity, but there's a lot of synchronicity there of things happening, and then they're connected to something else. And sometimes we don't really have the whole picture, but things are leading us somewhere. So it sounds like you were almost led somewhere. I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about, because what I wanted to talk to you about in this interview today for our listeners is a little bit about your book and Peter Drucker. But you know, I have to say, probably not everybody that's on the line have heard, even knows who Peter Drucker is or was, right?
right.
So if you could just give us a little primer real quick of,
Sure.
so who was Peter Drucker and why should we care? And if we're a leader.
Yeah. So I'll give you Peter Drucker kind of 101.
Yeah.
The first thing is that he was, first of all, he led a very long and productive life. He died 8 days before his 96th birthday. That was the end of 2005. He wrote something like, 40 books. It sold millions and millions of copies worldwide. And he had a very international outlook. He was born in Austria. He went to college and grad school in Germany. He worked in England for a while before he came to the United States. And he had this amazing three-pronged career as I said, as an author. He was a consultant to both major corporations, but he also did a lot of pro bono consulting for nonprofits. And he was a renowned and kind of beloved professor. He taught at a school named for him, the Drucker School in Claremont, California. Before that, though, he taught at New York University and some other schools. But from 71, when he went out there to Claremont, until I guess the last classes were held around maybe 2003, 2004, something like that. So he taught for a very long period of time. So people should care because he was really considered the father of modern management. But he went beyond that. And I think this is what's one of the reasons I wanted to write these books, is that he went beyond management. He wasn't just that. He had this very holistic attitude towards life. He was very interested in all sorts of subjects. He had intense intellectual curiosity, which is, I think, another thing that drove me to him. And he created the term knowledge worker, which many of us use that term now, but he created it. And he created it in the late 1950s, before there really were a lot of knowledge workers.
So what were like the main, like if you could give us like 4 main principles or points that Drucker brought out that you think would be worthy for people today who are listening?
The first, I would say, because to him it was a bedrock value, which was integrity and character. So we wouldn't have had those scandals that we were talking about in 2002. I don't think, had people exercised more of that, of their own integrity and their own character. Because integrity and character, they engender trust, and certainly we need trust, within that. So that was kind of like, I would say, this bedrock thing for him. Another thing was
That leaders need to have that.
that leaders need to have,
Yeah.
right? That unless you have that, it's just like this baseline.
Right. It's like the foundation. You can't be a leader if you don't have that foundation,
Right.
that type of person.
Exactly.
Right?
At least not a good leader. And I think another thing was that sometimes people forget about is this idea of lifelong learning. Now it's kind of a buzzword now, and there's lots of things about Drucker that have now become buzzwords, but Drucker really lived this. He lived this idea of lifelong learning. He had this 3-year, and then as later in life, 3-month study system where he would just pick a subject and then learn about it intensively on his own and put together his own curriculum, which was amazing. And sometimes he would call up the expert in this discipline and say, can I talk to you for a while? So he really embodied that. And, now, as I said, it's become kind of a buzzword, and it's easier to do now. Let's face it, there's all sorts of
Right. All this
ways.
information. Right.
Yeah. In terms of let's say a concept, he had this idea of what he called systematic or planned abandonment. And it sounds kind of harsh, but it's like that you get an idea of whatever your present reality is. And then you say, if I weren't already doing this particular thing, or if it's let's say a company and we didn't have this product, knowing what we know now, will we go into it? And if you didn't, or would you start doing this activity? And if you weren't doing it, then what would you do about it? Would you try to just stop doing it? Would you sell that, kind of product to a different company that might do better with it? Would you just get rid of it altogether? So it was this thing that was, again, that required introspection, and he felt that thinking was devalued. When you think about it, in a way, it's true that people don't really want to go into introspection, and they don't want to go into deep thinking, but he felt that those things were really necessary.
I think that's such an important point. And that's one of the things that, in the work that I do is so important when you're working in executive coaching and you're working with leaders, is that ability to sit back and self-reflect. And a lot of these things that you're talking about, to me, this is how I'm hearing them, have to do with the continuous mastery of self, right?
Yeah.
And the knowing of self and mastery of self, in order to be able to embody that leadership, and
Right.
then do the management quote activities or whatever they are. But there's something about the internal part of the leader that's so important, and that's what I'm hearing you describe. But it comes all the way from Drucker, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that really, comes out in people. And, related to that, with your, your kind of concept of, power presence and the whole idea of presence. One thing I feel that is important to bring up about both Peter and then the other person I really want to talk about today is Francis Hesselbein, who was was a longtime colleague and confidant of Peter's, and I have been for almost 12 years the managing editor of Leader to Leader, which was something she created back when it was called the Peter F. Drucker Foundation for Nonprofit Management. Eventually became the Francis Hesselbein Leadership Forum. And Francis just passed away this past December at the age of 107, and was pretty darn active till close to the end. And what I wanted to say about both those people is that people wanted to be in their presence. They wanted to be in Peter's presence. They wanted to be in Francis's presence. But there was just something about being with those people. If you were with them, even in a group, but certainly if you were lucky enough to be with them individually, you just felt that presence. You felt greatness. Now, not all of us are going to be able to do that, but I think we should aspire to being the sort of person where, hey, somebody wants to be in our presence. And what do we need to do? What sort of a person do we need to be in order for that to happen?
You mentioned the thing about presence, and I'm going to stop on that for a second, because you said people wanted to be around them. So there was something that they were embodying, right? There's some sort of how they made people feel or how they showed up. What do you think the essence of that was for Peter? Because they were obviously Peter was modeling some of the things he was talking about.
Exactly. I think one thing, and I think this is something that caught people by surprise with both Peter and Francis, is that, yes, they were like these pretty exalted people and very accomplished and what have you, but they were also very interested in the other person. Mm-hmm. So they would get them talking about themselves. And I think people thought, like, wow, I mean, why are they so interested, in me? But of course, they wanted to learn about the other person as well. And this, by the way, was something that Peter showed, because I talked to a number of his consulting partners, and they told me that so they would go for a consulting session with Peter, and he would just kind of get them talking. He would ask them all these questions, and they would talk about their organization. And they almost invariably said to me that kind of when they left, that, yes, they were exhilarated from meeting with Peter, but they felt like, well, I did all the talking. What good is this? And then what would happen is at a certain, I don't know when, how long, how much time would elapse, but they would get this extremely detailed letter from Peter about, here's what I heard about you and about your organization. And, kind of here's what I think. So he was drinking all this in and then turning it into this amazing report. So I think that was part of it, is that they felt that they were surprised at the interest and to kind of get them talking, but it got them talking in a way that they understood themselves better and their organization better. So one guy I'll certainly give a shout out to, because I go kind of fairly far back with him, I think till about maybe 2002 or 2003, a very cool professor at the Drucker School named Jeremy Hunter, Jeremy is one of the very early people into mindfulness in business. And one thing that I learned from something, it was actually not something he told me, it was something that he put on Facebook. And Jeremy, I should say, is half Japanese. And so he wrote something that he had learned from some teacher in Japan or something, that I believe loosely translated was, cherish this encounter, for it will not happen again. Wow. And I wrote a couple of blog posts about that, because when you think about it, if you have these folks like Peter or Francis or anybody else anywhere near that level, at any one time, that could be the last time you will ever talk to them again, or you'll ever be with them again. And you don't necessarily know that. So you have to be present to cherish this encounter. And what I've tried to do even more than that is for lots of other folks realize that this could be the last time that I will ever have a conversation with you or see you in person. And I felt that Jeremy just, who knows, that day he may just have put that on Facebook because, he couldn't think of anything else. But it had a really profound effect on me.
If we embodied that, what you just described, as if I'm treating someone as if it's the last encounter and I'm fully present, well, how transformational that could be. I mean, right? I mean, and just what, and I always ask people, what do you want? What imprint do you want to leave? And there's that's part of conscious choice, right? That's being present, but it's also choosing an imprint that you want to be your imprint in every interaction. And it sounds like that's a lot of what you received from Drucker and also Francis was an imprint. It's like a stamp on you.
I'm sure there's all sorts of folks, for people who are listening and watching today, who they've got other people that they admire. Well, what is it that you can learn from them? And as you said, do it on a conscious basis, because I think unless you're really conscious and intentional about it, it's hard to do. And it also really dovetails with, kind of my work on the future, which in many ways came out of Peter's, and the title of my second book, Create Your Future the Peter Drucker Way, is like when you're saying about what kind of imprint that you want to leave, I feel in relation to my work about the future, it's like, what kind of world do you want to live in?
And it's bigger. Yes, absolutely. So, I'm sorry, keep going.
And can you create that by what you're doing, either individually or organizationally, or both? Because I think, a lot of people would say, well, I want to live in a, more peaceful world. I want to live in, people can get along better. And so, what are some steps that you can take within your own life and in your own work and kind of in your journey. And again, when I think about myself, looking back, really, if I look back at now to that time, 36 years ago when I started, or I guess 37 years ago now when I started that management class, really, I'd be like, wow, if you said all these things came about in the 37 years, I'd say, sign me up. That's really amazing. But of course, a lot had to happen along the way. The things that I learned about teaching, the things that I learned about librarianship, I'm able to apply those in my writing, in my in my work for leader to leader. So I feel it's like nothing is wasted. And I feel people should understand that, because some people feel, oh, well, this particular thing didn't work out, but then kind of disown it. And I don't. You can disown parts of it, but certainly there are parts that you can salvage that I think can really help you in whatever your current or maybe even future work would be.
Yeah, I think there's so much wisdom in what you just described, because I think you're talking about a lot of different things that come together, and it's about the total human that we are, right? And the work of a leader, right? And the work of continuously being curious, of being present, of learning, and then also synthesizing all the parts of yourself into the best. I mean, you said when you were in the presence of Francis and Peter that you wanted to be your best. It's,
Right.
how do you inspire that in others? It's also by being your best, right? And it's that self mastery. And so I love the way you bring in all of those facets, Bruce, because I think that's so important. Okay, so there's so much I could talk to you about. We've only hit the surface and we're almost running out of time. So I want to focus on a couple things before we go. So just so that I got you. I know you said you're the managing editor of Leader to Leader, which is well, you'll tell us what it is, but I know what it is.
Right.
But
So yeah.
yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
So leader to leader, as I said, Francis created this. Francis Hesselbein in 1996, which was 5 years or 6 years after she started the what was then the Peter F. Drucker Foundation for Nonprofit Management. So the idea, as I see it with leader to leader, is leaders writing for other leaders. So we have a wide readership, but especially people who are leaders in one form or another. It could be business, it could be nonprofits, government, education, all sorts of things. What can people learn in a real direct way from those leaders? And again, it could be leaders, it could be leaders of organizations, but also
Thought
thought
leaders.
leaders.
Right.
Yeah. So a great thing for me is being able to kind of work with folks to help them say what they want to say in the best possible way. Because I feel lots of people, no matter how exalted they are, need help with that. And whether you're working with them directly or through, their intermediaries, whether they're publicists or editors or whoever they might be. But I feel like at this first kind of rung of the ladder, that I know what we have to do so people can get a lot out of our article. So I have to, because I'm working with some of these really high level people, I have to be able to project what I know in a very respectful way, because I feel like I work well with people, but giving them the respect that they deserve. But if there's times that I feel that they need to change something or do something differently or go back to the drawing board, then I have to do that. And that doesn't always come natural to me. But because I believe in what I'm doing, and I believe that this is something greater than me. This publication that's been won awards, and it's been around for 27 years. Has people all over the world reading it, and it's I would say most people interact with it online. It's part of Wiley is the co-publisher along with the Francis Hesselbein Leadership Forum. So people see it on the what's called the Wiley Online Library, but of course it comes up on Google and Google Scholar, in many cases, and various other databases too. So people tend to these days, especially like so much else, even though there is a print, and actually it's a beautiful print publication, but really nowadays I would say most people interact with it in the online. So we've had great people. Peter, back when he was still alive, Peter wrote for Francis, wrote a fantastic column in every issue, and I got to work with her on that column. Again, these things where when I step back and go, wow, I not only met these people, but I worked with them, and I, some cases over a long period of time. And so nobody can take that away from me, no matter what might happen to me in the future. I know that I kind of, did all these things. And so I think that with leader to leader, another important thing is that it be very helpful and useful for people so that they can apply what they're reading in Leader to Leader like right away, or find, what are the one or two things in this article that I can start applying right away.
As the managing editor of that, you're curating a lot of information around leadership continuously.
Exactly.
And so I think that is valuable for people who are looking for some sort of resource on some current thinking around leadership. So that's why I asked you about that.
Yeah, thank you. And one point related to that is it really does involve kind of the latest thinking, because very often somebody is adapting something from a new book of theirs or a book that hasn't even come out yet. So this represents their latest thinking. And
Right.
very often it's cutting edge thinking, but it's grounded in reality.
Right.
It just
Which is what I like, right? I think what I think the audience likes, and what I also subscribe to, is that we take the research and we take all the academic pieces behind it, or the wherever we're getting this information from, but also distilling it and translating it into practical reality that people can use on a daily basis. And so that's what I like about that, the Leader to Leader that does that. You talk a lot about creating the future, and I think we're in a space where people are feeling a little, I don't know if it's disillusioned, but perhaps overwhelmed on how they can contribute to creating the future, especially as leaders in organizations. There's so much changing. There's so many things that we don't know. Technology is changing. The workforce is changing. Everything has changed around us. So what advice do you have to anyone listening about creating the future as a leader?
Well, because the future was such a big part of Drucker's work, I mean, just all over his work in terms of book titles, articles, chapter titles, but he never actually wrote a whole book about the future. He didn't, use the word synthesize many times, and I'm a big believer in that word and in trying to synthesize information. So what I decided to do was to synthesize it into one book that became Create Your Future the Peter Drucker Way. And so what I discovered was that really for Drucker, even though he didn't use this terminology, that the future was a mindset, and that you had to really be thinking about it. So I think that people need to get back, in answering your question, that people need to kind of get back to first principles. What is it that I want to do? But also, where am I now, both on an individual level and maybe on an organizational level? What's my present reality? And what kind of world do I want to live in and do I want to create? And then what can I do? And I think there's lots of steps. And sometimes it's also, if you want to create the future, Drucker had this fantastic concept that he used for many, many years called the future that has already happened. So it's a little bit of an unwieldy term, but in that book that I mentioned, I just used the term, I credited that, but called it inevitability. But part of it was saying that in many ways the future has already happened, and so, but it hasn't been, the full effects are not quite there yet. So what can you take knowing what's already happened, but knowing that the full effects are not out there? And what about that can you somehow maybe improve, build a business on, build a consulting practice on, build a course, university course, whatever it might be. But you can do that by, we get back to that reflection.
Right.
You do have to do some reading. You do have to do some checking of things online. You do need to talk to other people. Drucker is very big about getting beyond your four walls. And I think a lot of people don't do that. Kind of get out there and is saying, he's interested in meeting people. Even people who thought that what they did was sort of mundane, but Peter would kind of draw them out. So this is how you learned about these things, about the future that's already happened. And then you can kind of do something about it. So I think just realizing the future is a mindset, realizing the future is created day by day. It's like you don't go to that leap of 5-10 years from now. That it's created by lots of different people on a day-by-day basis, by their actions, by their decisions, by their choices, and that you can do that too. So I certainly understand that people feel overwhelmed. I do too. And especially the folks that you're mentioning who, they're running big organizations. They have, probably more responsibilities than I do. But I think also a lot of those folks tend to be pretty good at taking lots of things in, and, one of the things I discovered in the Drucker world was that a lot of his followers tended to be very high achiever people, really just people like, wow, they were intellectually curious. They ran big organizations. They were always trying to learn things. They were always trying to meet people. And so I felt like, wow, that's something to kind of keep in mind too, that Drucker, that they were attracted to him, but also he was attracted to them. And so I think that people, again, if they self-reflect, if they just kind of step back and go to first principles, I think they'll find, if not all the time, I think they'll find some of the time to create their future.
Yeah. No, I love it. Thank you.
Sure.
There's so much there. It reminds me a lot of one of the things that we talk about on this show a lot is also paying attention to who you're being while you're doing things. And
Right.
a lot of that is what you just described is, who are you being while you're doing these things?
Yeah. Well, Francis Hesselbein, had this thing of, leadership is more how to be than how to do it.
Right.
Yes, you have to do things, leaders have to do things,
Right.
but not, here's the mechanics. And that's certainly important too. And Peter, I believe, was the same way. In a lot of cases, he sort of stepped out of the mechanics of things, but the whole idea of who you are, how to be, what's your character, what's your integrity,
Right. Right. It's the
that's what
foundational piece that can carry you into the unknown. And right.
Exactly.
That's what I'm getting from what you're saying. Exactly. Thank you so much for spending time with us today. I mean, and imparting your wisdom and your knowledge bank with us. A little tiny piece of that knowledge bank. I think the listeners will get a lot out of this. So I appreciate it.
Well, you're quite welcome, and thank you for the opportunity. I really enjoyed talking about this, and I can talk about these things, all day.
Yeah, so, I could too, by the way.
Yeah.
And so
I appreciate the opportunity. This is quite interesting experience for me.
Well, thank you again.